Do you find that sometimes you pick up the Bible and read passages that feel as though they could have been written directly to you, and you just want to put it on a fridge magnet and keep it always in front of your mind? For most of us, this passage in Luke is not one of those. This passage is more likely to be one that we skip over on our way to something more encouraging. Something about Jesus being the Prince of Peace, rather than this one where Jesus says, "Do you think I've come to bring peace? No, I tell you, rather, division." And we read this and we want to say, no, Jesus, you're obviously having a really bad day. How about you just go back to bed and get a bit more sleep? And when we have that sort of reaction, it usually means that we need to look a little bit more closely at what Jesus is saying. And last week I was listening to a white South African Bible scholar, and he said that during the struggle to rid his country of apartheid, this passage was one that he and others held very dear as they fought for equality. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2, 2 against 3. They will be divided. Father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. He said, well, that's how it was. Any white person seeking to dismantle apartheid did so in strong opposition to parents and in-laws. There was division in every family. And those fighting for justice took comfort in Jesus' words that in the struggle for God's kingdom, there will be times when this must be so. Well, that's how it is whenever people oppose unjust structures. Division is not the aim, but it is an inevitable consequence of working for change. That's how it was in South Africa in the 80s. That's how it was for Jesus and his first followers. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He knows that escalated conflict awaits him. Conflict that will range from trick questions to false accusations, to trial, to execution. He knows he is heading into conflict. And not only does he choose not to avoid the conflict, but he will actually incite conflict through at least three, extremely provocative actions. 1, he will enter Jerusalem riding on a donkey, with crowds shouting, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." And he does not stop them. This will make a mockery of the Roman garrison that would be entering the city at about the same time from the opposite direction. 2, he will make a huge scene at the temple and accuse the temple authorities of corrupting the house of God. And 3, then he will tell a parable about tenant farmers who abuse and kill the owner's messengers and ultimately the owner's son. This is a clear accusation that the religious authorities in Jerusalem had turned from God in order to feather their own nests. As Jesus walks from Galilee toward Jerusalem with his disciples, he is almost certainly planning these provocative acts of non-violent resistance. He is a man of peace, but when injustice has the upper hand and good people are being oppressed, people of peace resist. Think of Gandhi marching toward the Arabian Sea with more than 60,000 Indians to make salt in a non-violent but highly provocative protest against British rule. Think of Martin Luther King making his "I Have a Dream" speech that I talked about last week. Like Jesus, These men sought peace, but were not afraid of provoking conflict. And like Jesus, the conflict they provoked would take their lives. Do you think I've come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. There is a difference between peacemakers and those who keep the peace at any price. Martin Luther King was right to choose not to pacify authorities in the US who were enforcing racial segregation and preventing black children from receiving the education and opportunities they needed to climb out of poverty. Keeping the peace was not what history called for at that time. Jesus likewise lived in a time in which his own people were being crushed under the brutal power of the Roman Empire, and also by their own religious and civil leaders who were collaborating with Rome. The only peace possible under such a system was the peace of humiliated submission, the peace of terrified silence, the peace of whole families starving because their land and livelihood had been taken away. Jesus was not going to settle for that sort of peace. And behind the violence of Rome was a darker power that has kept people in submission ever since we left Eden. The power of violence, the power of money, the power of evil itself. There is no keeping the peace where evil holds sway. So Jesus chose not to keep the peace. He chose to protest, knowing that his protest would divide his nation. People would be with him or against him. People who collaborated with Rome, people who were terrified of Roman reprisals, people who feared Roman power more than they trusted God, these would be against Jesus. And the division would go deep. It would cause cracks to open up in the bedrock of society, the family. We can so easily miss this, especially when we read about, let's say, mothers-in-law turning against daughters-in-law. We think, well, what else is new? It was ever so. But actually it was not ever so. This was a highly patriarchal society where the father ordered what everyone would think and say and do. Jesus is saying that his own claim to allegiance will get down to that bedrock level and break the power of the patriarch so that family members would all start making up their own minds about him. 2 for Jesus, 3 against. To his original hearers, that would have sounded like utter chaos, like anarchy. So he spoke to them about interpreting the times. This was no ordinary time in history. In Jesus, God was showing up to begin to set the world right. And if God has shown up, then that was no time to cling to the old power structures. It was time for those with power to let go and hand the reins back to God. It was time for those cringing under evil human regimes to see that ultimate authority belongs to the one who loves them, not to the one who's exploiting them. The religious leaders of his time should have seen that. But they did not. Their fear of Rome and their love of their own position in society blinded them to what Jesus was doing, as it blinds so many people throughout history. So far, this sounds like a call to revolt, doesn't it? To take up arms against their oppressor. But no, the very next thing Jesus says is when you go with your accuser before a magistrate, on the way, make every effort to settle the case. Try to make peace. Don't antagonize your accuser. Now, it's hard to square that with those provocative acts that Jesus is planning for Jerusalem. Except for two things we need to remember about Jesus at this time. One, he is seeking to draw into himself the fury of all illegitimate power, and then to exhaust it in his death and defeat it in his resurrection. That is what he came to do, to take it all on himself while sparing his followers. Just think how difficult that was for him to orchestrate. Normally, when paranoid regimes kill ringleaders of a rebellious group, they then round up all the followers and send them to the same fate. As Jesus walks to Jerusalem, we see him working very hard to find a strategy to make sure that does not happen, to make sure that he dies alone. The second thing that helps us make sense of Jesus' words is that he could see that Jerusalem was heading for destruction. The utter devastation that we know arrived in 70 AD, maybe about 40 years later. Now, I don't think this was divine foreknowledge. I think it was him doing what he told his followers to do, reading the signs of the times. He would have been deeply aware of the rising anger of the majority of the people who were humiliated and hungry. He saw them picking up their knives and throwing off their caution, and he knew that if this tiny little nation took on the might of Rome, it would be crushed. So, he tells them to make peace with Rome if at all possible. And in the first few verses of the next chapter, he will very sternly warn them that if they don't turn from this path of armed rebellion, they will all perish. And we know from history that they didn't turn, and they did perish. So where does that leave us? Well, this is where it leaves me. It leaves me in awe of this man who stood up to one of the most brutal regimes in history and used his own body as a lightning rod to take the full force of its fury into himself while ensuring that his followers were spared. He died that they might live. He died that we might live, as we give our allegiance to him rather than to the power structures of our own day. And whenever I find myself in conflict, I need to return to these words of Jesus. As a follower of Jesus, we stand with him against the power structures of our day. And because of that, we will find ourselves in conflict sometimes. We will be in conflict with institutions and people who exploit the vulnerable. We will be in conflict with institutions and people who rule through force or coercion or intimidation. In that sort of conflict, we are called to stand firm, to provide shelter and support for victims, but never to recklessly incite violence. This is a real issue throughout our world at the moment. And one on which I'm not going to pretend that I have any answers. Because our people throughout the world, especially our leaders, are needing to work out how to respond to the growing coercive, unjust power of China. We need our leaders to be incredibly good at reading the signs of the times right now, while there is so much danger in any potential miscalculation. We think of it in that context, I think we can see the great wisdom of Jesus' words here, even if we find them hard to hear. But We can't assume that all our conflicts are like that. Sometimes I find myself in conflict just because someone doesn't like me, or because they feel they're in competition with me, or because I have done something dumb or thoughtless. That sort of conflict calls for humility, for apology, for laying down of my rights, for doing all I can to make peace with my accuser. But some conflict is inevitable for followers of Jesus. When I say that Jesus is Lord, I will immediately be in conflict with anyone who claims that something else or someone else is Lord. That sort of conflict is a given for the Christian life. But if I call Jesus Lord, I will be obliged to obey the one I call Lord. And that means following Jesus on the path of servanthood and sacrifice and humility. While knowing there will be conflict, I will do absolutely everything in my power to make peace. May the peace of the Lord be with you. Amen.